Hello! This video continues my work on the water splash effect. This time I want to add small water splashes, the kind you see when water cuts through the air. To do that I need a new visual element, and that element will be a wave pattern. So we'll start from the very beginning by creating a texture. While preparing for this video and thinking about how to approach water, I looked at several interesting workflows from other artists. I picked a few ideas that resonated with me, combined different approaches, and added my own interpretation on top. As always, before opening any software, I start with observation. I open the internet and look at how water actually behaves, what kind of patterns it forms, what repeats, and what feels natural. Even chaotic motion like water still follows certain rules. And those repeating structures and rhythms are exactly what we are looking for when we create stylized textures. Now let's move into Substance Designer. The idea here is to combine several different patterns into a single texture, in a way that mimics how water behaves in real life. The first pattern will define the main wave motion, something like small ripples on the surface of the sea. I start with moisturize noise and stretch it horizontally to give it a more directional wave-like feeling. Then I soften it using a blur high-quality grayscale node, normalize the values with outer levels, and apply a slow blur using the same textures as an input set to max. This gives me soft, rounded shapes, almost like little circular ripples. However, I don't really want solid shapes here. What I am actually after is the lower contour, something closer to an outline or a thin wave edge. To achieve this, I subtract normals generated from the same grayscale texture, but with different intensity values. Even though this technique might feel a bit unintuitive at first, it gives me exactly the kind of water edge I am looking for. By subtracting normals with different intensity values, I am essentially isolating the edge of the shape. Instead of keeping the full volume of the wave, I remove the soft interior and keep only the transition area, which works perfectly for stylized water details. After subtracting the normals, I end up with a colored image. Since I need a clean black and white mask, I convert it using a grayscale converter and then normalize the values with auto levels. The first pattern is now ready. For the second one, I simply duplicate the setup and slightly tweak the parameters. I increase the blur high quality grayscale value, change the noise disorder, and push the slow blur a bit further. This gives me a similar ripple pattern, but with a large scale. Almost like a second layer of water moving underneath the first one. And that's perfectly fine. Water is layered and complex. It's never just a single pattern. I combine these two patterns using a blend node set to add. The larger scale pattern goes into the foreground, and I reduce its influence to about half, since it plays a secondary role in the overall texture. At this point, the main ripple pattern is almost complete. What's left is to break the straight lines and make the surface feel more organic. I start with the levels node to slightly boost the contrast. Then I apply a multidirectional warp grayscale using Perlin noise, set to max mode with two directions, to introduce control chaos into the pattern. Finally, I add a subtle regular warp with a small intensity and a Gaussian noise, just to push the randomness a little bit further. And with that, the first ripple pattern can be considered finished. Now I want to add a bit of foam. To do this, I start with a fluid node and feed it into a non-uniform directional warp grayscale. The first two inputs of this node, the main input and the intensity input, both come from the fluid texture. For the warp angle input, I use slightly blurred clouds too, just to introduce some variations in direction. After that, I tweak the contrast a bit, and with just a few adjustments, I already get a pattern that feels very similar to water foam. I don't want this foam everywhere. Foam usually appears in areas where water collides, breaks, or changes direction. In our case, those areas are defined by the outlines of the sea ripple pattern, so I blend the foam pattern with the ripple pattern using blend node set to add sub, where the sea ripples act as the foreground and the foam as the background. Using add sub, blending allows the foam to appear exactly where the ripples break and overlap, instead of placing foam manually. I let the wave pattern drive its distribution, which feels much closer to how water behaves in reality. At this stage, I want to add a bit more volume and introduce some subtle color variation to the texture. For that, I create a third pattern, something I think of as sea depths. I start with a gradient dynamic node set to repeat addressing and vertical orientation. For the gradient input, I use a linear gradient 1 with a tailing value of 9. The grayscale input is based on clouds 2, sloped blur with itself, and slightly softened with a regular blur. This setup allows me to break uniformity and add gentle vertical variation, which makes the surface feel deeper and more dimensional. This pattern doesn't add detail directly, instead it subtly modulates the texture, breaking uniformity and adding a sense of depth, like light and currents moving beneath the water surface. This pattern isn't finished yet, I want to soften it further and make it feel less defined. To do that, I applied a non-uniform blur grayscale using an inverted grayscale version of the same pattern and the intensity input. This way, some areas remain slightly sharper, while others become more diffused. After that, I softened the shape even more with a regular blur, just to remove any remaining hard edges. Finally, I add the depth pattern very subtly to the main texture with ripples and foam. Its influence is minimal, it's not meant to be seen directly, only to add a sense of volume and variation. At this point, the texture is almost finished, but right now it still looks a bit too clean and uniform. Real water is rarely perfect. There are always tiny bubbles, droplets, and small imperfections. To break this smoothness, I multiply the texture with a grunge concrete noise. This noise contains small, almost pixel-like dots, which work really well to suggest tiny water bubbles or droplets. Since this noise is quite gray on its own, multiplying it makes the whole texture darker and flatter. So after that, I normalize the values using auto levels and then push the contrast further with the levels node, until the result feels right to me. And with that, the texture is done. I hope this breakdown was useful and informative. In the next video, we'll take this texture into Unity and start adding the missing elements directly in the shader. Thank you for your attention.